in this day and age, when people are more aware of these things, they still continue to do it. We need to learn from their mistakes and not continue to do the same. And if we don't, we are committing a bigger mistake than what they committed 150 or 100 years back. Let's start correcting ourselves and let's start doing the right thing. If our intention is good, then what we do should also be good. Good intent should lead to good content. Conservation, after all, is for everyone. To do conservation is not just the prerogative of humans not just prerogative of ensuring that humans survive better. It's also ensuring that all species survive well, because the better they survive, the impact is felt by us. People have made money destroying nature. Now you can't make money, but you can at least, have a decent life by fixing nature. It's challenging, it's heartbreaking a lot of the times, but it's also the need of the hour. If your child or your grandchild has to have a better future, if we do not conserve now, they have no future.
So thank you so much, Dr. Sanjay, for taking out the time and coming to the studio. You're on a very short visit to Kanashantivanam and you're leaving later this afternoon. So thank you for taking this time out and sitting with us here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I think this is a wonderful place, and having interacted with all of you yesterday and this morning, I think it's my privilege to be here and be talking to you. So thank you very much.
No, it is entirely our honor. And you have been involved with the conservation field for such a long time. And one of the key areas you've been involved in is risk assessment for various species. So what all does that entail, assessing how much of a risk a species is at?
Well, it is a process, first of all, the risk assessment, which is, again, as we call it, the IUCN Red List of threatened species, which has a set protocol of assessing the status of species for their entire distribution range, or for any range that we determine as for understanding the threat status. And so the species status assessment itself is an entire process, and it takes a whole lot of different people, stakeholders, to come together and derive the status, because one of the biggest issues is not just the threat to the species, caused by humans and other things that are happening. One of the biggest threats is lack of information. And so, getting people together is critical. When just a few people do the assessments, it comes out all wonky. But if you have a whole group of people who know about the species, know about the habitat it lives in, and all the other related aspects, then the assessment becomes much more robust and more scientific in approach, and gets peer reviewed as the assessment happens in a workshop mode. So that's very, very quickly putting, because it's a complicated process, and I can go on for the next 5 days, I'm sure.
Yeah, it sounds with so many people involved. And also I've seen the kind of species you worked on, they don't stick to one kind of species. There's plants, there's mushrooms, there's fish, there's reptiles.
Yes.
So your work has the whole gamut of the natural world.
Absolutely.
So that must be requiring so much effort to kind of coordinate, in different fields.
Absolutely. So most recently, we did the assessments of tarantulas in India.
Wow.
Yeah, about 59 species, 60 species.
There are 60 species of tarantula in India.
Yes.
Wow.
Described.
Wow.
There are many more that are not yet described. So we can only assess those that we know. So when we were doing the assessments, we had at least about 25 people in a workshop, and gathering data for many a species for the first time was a challenge. There were also some species that we had already assessed way back in, about 10, 12 years back. And so a lot has changed since then to now. So updating that information also requires a lot more inputs from people. And so it was a very fruitful exercise, because we, at the end of the day, we were able to get a lot of species for which earlier there was no information available and would have perhaps been categorized as data deficient about 10, 12 years back. Now we have better information and therefore a better assessment status for them.
Absolutely.
So it was a fantastic exercise.
Yeah, so the information then contributes to conservation efforts. You can
Absolutely.
actually conserve something once you have info
Absolutely.
about it. And one of the things that over the last few years made a lot of headlines was the vulture population, how the vulture population declined. So you're actually, the target is always moving, the species status changes so quickly, because vultures within our lifetime, I mean, within 10 years, actually, within a span of 10 years, they went from abundant to rare sightings when you get excited. White-backed vulture, you get excited when you see one now.
Right.
And so how do you keep up to date with that? You must be having to continually gather data from the field.
Oh, that's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't let it go just because you assessed a species, because times are changing so fast, situations are changing so fast, and whatever we assess today may not be applicable in the next few years. And so we need to keep up to date. And species being what they are, and the way they're distributed and the way they get impacted by the various different things that are happening around them, it's very difficult to even broad brush something. So, just because you say, okay, I know the species and therefore, no, this species of vulture and therefore all the vultures are impacted the same way. No, it doesn't work that way, because different vultures have different habits. They prefer different habitats, and the threats to them are slightly different. There might be one or two common threats, but those threats may not be the only ones that are driving them to extinction. There may be several other things. So when we look at, say, vultures, as you asked, as an example, is, we need to keep up with their status as much as possible, so that our assessments of their status can also be dynamic.
Absolutely.
And that's the critical part. Unfortunately, species assessments are not very well funded. And because there are so many different species out there, it also becomes very, very difficult to keep reassessing them.
Yeah, because how do you justify funding for an assessment that's already been done?
Exactly. So, ideally, they should be reassessed periodically. Okay, whatever that periodicity may be, you can decide. But the point is that to do it periodically takes a lot of effort and a lot of resources. Of course, people are out there collecting data, but bringing them together and doing the assessment itself is a very expensive affair. So that's a challenge that we've faced all this while, and we continue to face. So,
But where does the funding really come from? Because this work is more or less largely invisible in the public domain, because you are collecting information, you are researching. There's, of course, the glamour side of things is different. It's like the filmmakers, the documentary filmmakers who are making the film, who are on camera. So for them, I suppose funding is slightly easier to get. But what about research for species? Like, where does the funding actually come from?
You hit the nail on the head, and it's not charismatic doing assessments. Okay. People look at wildlife and say, "Wow, such a fantastic job out there. Go into the field. It's a sort of a job, and it's not even a job. It's a hobby. It's a great thing to do, and to make money out of enjoying life out in the wild is one thing. But not everything in conservation is just going out into the field and collecting data or, enjoying nature. Yes, we've all done that. But that's just one small part. Other parts also include things that you work behind the scenes.
Absolutely.
Okay, there's for example, analyzing stuff, working in the office, doing communications, doing accounts, raising funds, working with policymakers, fighting with the government. All these things are, constant. Okay. And these are all things that do not get much attention, and people don't know about it. So we have quite a challenge there. And when it comes to species assessments, that again is something that happens behind the scenes. So while the fact of conservation today hinges on the status of species based on the IUCN Red List. The process of getting them assessed or updated from time to time is not considered as important by many a funding agency, which somehow, beats the logic, but that's where it is. So yes, it's very, very difficult to get funding for species assessments, which we need. What we try and do is we try and raise funds from various different entities, agencies, conservation organizations, government sometimes, and donors, philanthropists. But if there is a group that is, sort of interested to know what's happening to wildlife and want to conserve wildlife and wants to help with, wildlife conservation, I think the basic of understanding what's the status of species requires much attention, which is highly not funded, and therefore, if they can support in this particular aspect, it will help conservation in a much better way.
Absolutely, because the glamour things, as you said, the tiger gets so much attention because it is a species. It's that draws so much attention, but there's so many other species in a forest. It's not just the plant species; they don't get that much attention. The insect species don't get that much attention, and this entire sort of focus on some species. And even in the plant world, you gave us a little talk yesterday, even in the plant world, it's forests that get a lot of attention. It's plantation of trees. But you mentioned that equally important is the plantation of grasslands, and that really doesn't get too much attention at all.
Grasslands, scrublands, all these are open areas that have a lot of vegetation and have some unique biodiversity in them, do not get much attention. Yes, because not many of the species there are charismatic. Perhaps not as charismatic as some of the species that we are used to, but these habitats used to have charismatic species like wolves,
Absolutely.
jackals,
Cheetahs,
foxes, black bucks, different antelopes, deer, and all those species that are really interesting also used to exist. Okay. Now with shrinking grasslands, with shrinking open habitats, you see huge shrinkage in their numbers, and many a place these species have gone extinct or they've been extirpated from those places. So now you have black bucks in a few sanctuaries here and there, wolves just hanging on somewhere here and there,
Yeah.
jackals almost gone. So there are all these grassland species, predominantly grassland species.
The hog deer is another one that we hardly see now.
Exactly, they're getting impacted. So you're right, it's the charismatic species that are getting attention, and everything from other plants, even forest plants, to open scrubland or grasslands plants and species that are not charismatic are suffering from not being recognized as much or getting the right kind of support that they require.
So yesterday you told us a very interesting statistic about grasslands and how important they were historically in India. Whenever I think of the past in India, I think, oh, was covered in forest and there was forest everywhere and tigers roaming. The Asiatic lion used to exist here, and they were. But you painted a different picture. What historically was India like in terms of forest and grassland?
Forests have always been restricted to the hilly areas and perhaps in certain other areas where there are some scrub forests. But mostly, much of India, more than 60% of India, was used to be grasslands. And perhaps not everywhere was it just plain grasslands. It used to have some scrub, some isolated trees and stuff like that. But nonetheless, not a forest.
Not a forest, yeah.
And so our entire impression of what India needs is from the perception that we have had from our perhaps our peers and from our previous generation, this entire perception of we need to have forests everywhere. We need to have forests. The idea is that we need to have forests, but they should be where they historically were. We don't need to recreate forests in open grasslands, in open areas. Okay. So, and it's also important that we recognize where are these open areas, where are the forest lands, and put it out there so that when people are interested and have the good intention of, say, doing some plantation work or want to restore, they at least know what to plant where. So, I'm constantly looking at this particular phrase, good intent, bad content. And this repeats itself over and over again because people with good intent, with no knowledge, end up doing something that is terrible for the ecology. Sometimes
it's better to leave
not
it
do anything is better than doing something bad.
Wow.
Something wrong rather.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's a terrible situation we are in because I don't want to be negative to anyone. I don't want to say, hey, you're doing something really terrible.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's ecology. Something happens to it. It's sort of stamped in time. Okay. It's not like, you can go back and correct something. Like, for example, you build a building in the wrong place, the court issues an order of bringing it down. It can be done. You do something with ecology, no matter who or however powerful they may be, and ask you to turn it back, will not happen that easily. Okay, so it's ecology is more set in stone, and mind you, we as human beings have been here in India for say 50 to 70,000 years, the modern humans, but the ecology around us has evolved for millions of years. So we need to understand that we are just one small speck in this entire spectrum of system equation. That unless we fall in place and recognize that and understand that, yes, whatever has happened in the past has happened, we need to start, investing our time and resources and intellect in doing it better to bring it back to not its original state, definitely not, but at least close to the original state. We need to understand the basics, and when we understand the basics, no matter how tough it is, we can still do it. And it'll take time, and it'll be a wonderful product at the end of it. But we need to, first of all, educate ourselves as to what it is and educate others, especially funding agencies, the CSRs and organizations that are willing to give money but are looking at tangible results at the end of that financial year, which by itself is a huge issue when it comes to ecology, because one reason why plantations are the way they are, people plant in open areas, in grasslands with forest species, is that when you take a funding agency or a funder to a place, the funder recognizes tree growth and say, oh wow, you've done a wonderful job.
It's very visible.
It's visible.
Yeah.
Okay. But if you were to say, show the same person grass, they say, really, what is this? Because nobody understands the importance of grass. Yeah. And unfortunately, from the government to everybody else, have classified grasslands as wastelands.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, traditionally we think of Banjar Zameen is as grassland.
Exactly.
That's where nothing is growing. It's only grass. We don't even consider it, fertile, because it's only grass is growing.
And that's the most fertile land. Okay, grassland is the most fertile land. Even forest soil is not as fertile.
This is in terms of carbon content.
No, fertility of the soil.
Fertility of the soil itself.
Yeah,
wow. Yeah. And also the carbon content you were mentioning, the carbon sequestering that happens in a grassland is much more than happens in a hardwood forest.
The carbon that gets sequestered into the soil is pretty high for the vegetative growth of the grass itself. Okay, if you say look at a forest, the vegetative growth is very obvious. It's very tall. Okay, and for that the sequestration into the soil is highly skewed. Whereas in grasslands, the vegetative growth is very small, but for that the sequestration of carbon into the soil is very high.
Yes.
Okay, it's again skewed, but on the higher side. So when we talk about this to people, it sort of is not just surprising, it's an eye opener, but also people it's difficult because it's not that intuitive. And you say, oh, grass. The other problem is that not only you consider grasslands as wastelands, but because of management practices, burning of grass.
Absolutely.
With this bizarre idea that if you burn grass, it grows better.
We do it in national parks also.
In protected areas, in reserved forests, and even in open areas, people burn grasses with the hope of getting better fodder for their cattle. It's actually doing the wrong thing in the sense that, very simply, if you were to look at any grass that is burned, with the advent of invasive species, the native grass is unable to grow back because it takes its own time to put out fresh leaves, and that happens after the first rains. Okay, so until then it remains dry.
So now the invasive species has an upper hand.
The invasive species, on the other hand, may be able to establish themselves, much before the grass puts out its next set of blades. So grasslands, native grasses, and native herbs and shrubs in India have suffered from invasive species because of this. So burning grass leads to more invasives coming in. In some of the Himalayan areas, burning grass has made trees come in. It's not just invasive grass or herbs, but even invasive trees have come in. So,
and invasive trees you were mentioning have a much better, quicker rate of growth compared to native trees. And why is that?
So, any species that is evolved with all the other species around it, has a constant competition for resources. It's a predator of something or prey of something else. Okay, so, and it also has various different things that might impact it negatively. Sometimes a lot, sometimes less. Bacterial and viral infections, fungal infections, so many different things. So all these things are interplaying for a species that is native to its own distribution range. When you remove that species from that area and transplant it or translocate it to an area where the species never occurred before, okay, it may carry some of its diseases and all that. The point is that a lot of the things that kept it in place are not found there, which means that the plant has a much easier ride in terms of its growth because it does not have many other species that have co-evolved in its range to keep it, grounded.
Wow. So it has the invasive species always has an advantage.
So invasive species always have an advantage, and that's a double whammy for native species. So invasives not only have the advantage of growing fast, they grow fast, they are competing for space and resources, and the native species are already stressed in their own native regions, and this is an additional stress, so they reduce in numbers and die out eventually. So a lot of species like Lucus aspera, which is used to be one of the more common herbs. In fact, at one time people had wrongly even called it a weed. Okay, because when I was growing up, it was found everywhere. Okay, in and around Bangalore, everywhere Lucus aspera is this about 3 foot maximum, a herb that was found everywhere. Now you don't find it anywhere. It's replaced by a lot of different invasives. Parthenium is one.
Yes.
Touch me not. And the there are a few other species, and I can't even think of. I'm so irritated by these invasives that have really wiped our natives out of existence. So now you see these species, this particular Lucus aspera and other species that are being negatively impacted. You find them stuck in some corner somewhere, and if you're fortunate, you'll come across them, and that's it.
Wow.
Very few and far between.
So, in terms of invasive species, what do we classify as an invasive species or a non-local species? Because is it something that wasn't there in a particular area 10,000 years ago, a million years ago, a billion years ago? What kind of time are we looking at? Because it may, when do we start considering a thing a local species?
I don't think you can ever consider a species that has not evolved in a place and has been put there by humans as a species that is local ever. Because, however long it takes, nature is not as fast to recover some of these things and to even, assimilate a new species into the environment takes a very long time. For the environment to recognize the chemicals, to recognize the characteristics of that new species, and then adapt themselves or start producing certain chemicals in retaliation or predating on it, all that takes time. So, and it can't be done within 100, 200, even 1,000 years.
Naturally,
so, yeah. So when somebody says something is, for example, there's this term called naturalized in plants. Okay, I think it's done more harm. That definition has done more harm to the plants than anything else, because people say, oh, it's when we talk about something that is not native to an area, yes, but it is naturalized. So what? Tamarind is naturalized. So what? The point is that it is still not a native species in India, and it still causes problems, and it is it's taking up space. It is taking up it's providing a lot of chemicals that other biodiversity do not recognize. Grasses don't grow under it. Herbs don't grow under it. The chemicals that the leaves leach into the soil change the soil composition. There are a whole lot of different factors that play. And many a species of insects even do not grow under it. So you call it naturalized. Yes, for that species is able to sustain itself and become viable by itself without the help of humans. It can reproduce and establish itself. It has become a viable species in the area. But that viability has a very wrong connotation when it is when it is called naturalized. Okay, a naturalized species means it should also, be as conducive to all the other native species that were living around it. But
that's not the case.
This is not the case.
Yeah.
So, for all practical purposes, a naturalized species also is an invasive species.
But is there no migration among species that happens in a non-human way? I mean, I'm thinking plants, ocean currents carrying seeds, the wind carried plants, or animals migrating. Does it not happen in a non-human way in the natural world?
Of course it happens. And that's how the species also find their own limits of distribution. You find some species spread all across the world, the cosmopolitan species, and they have the ability to spread. There are some species that are highly restricted. It's because, again, they're so specialized to that particular characteristic in which they have evolved that they can't adapt themselves to any other area, any other habitat. So while they might have the ability to migrate, seeds or pollen can migrate, they might still be not viable because of their inability to adapt to those conditions. There are some non-native species, even if you plant them in an area that is not their native range, they do not become invasive because they still do not have the ability to become viable, okay, by themselves, self-sustaining. So there are such species also. So it's a very complex situation. It depends from species to species. There are some non-native species that become invasives after many years. Okay, more recently you see a horticultural plant, guava, which is a non-native species, is assuming the qualities of an invasive, and we see in quite a few forests in the Western Ghats where guava grows inside the forest.
Wow.
Okay, and this is not a good thing. So when did that shift happen? When did that gene mutate? When did that non-native, non-invasive species become an invasive? Is just a matter of time, matter of mutation. Okay, the right one for it to become invasive.
Okay. But playing the devil's advocate here, suppose somebody says, so what if it's an invasive species, it's doing well, it's a tree, this is natural evolution happening, be it through humans, be it through... What are the downsides to such a situation where an invasive species becomes dominant?
Yeah, my simple question to them is, are you worried? Are you okay with the non-native species or invasive species as much as you are okay with a native species going extinct? In other words, don't you care for the native species that already existed? Now, with this coming in, it already has its own home range that it may be doing well in its native range. Now, but it's coming and occupying this range of a species that is found nowhere else and is destroying the populations of this. So, aren't you concerned about this? It's a simple question that one needs to ask themselves to then get the answer. Now, where do you align yourself?
Where do you draw the line? Yeah. True. And the natural world is so connected, so interconnected actually, that an invasion in one part of the world can easily travel to another part. If you have migratory birds, you have this, and now humans, of course, traveling the world. That is, so it can have a domino effect all over the world actually.
Absolutely.
So it's interesting. What you mentioned is the information is needed. This conservation effort relies very much on information and a thoroughness to that information. I mean, to go in to a plantation situation just with half knowledge can actually have adverse effects. And this kind of information, I find, do you think that it was something brought in by the British, this thoroughness of information? Because in local communities, I find that taxonomically, they don't, we like in the hills, we have one word for woodpecker. We don't have different classifications. We have one word for dove. We don't have different class. It's only once you classify them as, such and such flame-backed woodpecker, slaty woodpecker, this, that. So do you think this is something that indigenously didn't grow, this art of taxonomy and identifying?
Well, actually, it's different in different places. I know in certain areas where people have names for every single species of water bird.
Wow.
Okay. Like in Tamil Nadu. Okay. So there, okay, maybe it's a water bird more readily seen and, have certain characteristics. And so they've named it as per those characteristics. Maybe in certain areas where, say, woodpeckers, all one sees is perhaps a flash here and there, and they can only hear it pecking wood, and maybe not much attention is paid because it's not that readily seen. So perhaps there are no differences noticed, or at least, they might have differences, or they might have noticed the differences, but
they don't describe them,
don't have different names for them.
Yeah.
So it all is a matter of how much of an interest the language has had by people. How much of an interest people have had by creating words for each of these species is the power of the language. Okay, and so it differs. You can't broad brush it. The point is that what we follow now is the Linnaean system of binomial nomenclature. So where every single species is given two names at least. And since that has come around, people have started formally describing these species, and it's a methodological process of describing species. And so you have names for various different species. Sometimes two or more species within a similar looking group of animals or
Yes,
plants.
yes.
Okay, very difficult. By sight, it's very difficult to say what species it is. But if you were to observe them behaviorally, very closely, perhaps, or even now with the use of genetics, you might then determine them to be different species. So that kind of finesse in species descriptions is not necessarily seen in other forms of classification. While some of our local cultures do have names for certain species, not for all. Some may have more names, some may have less names. It's all a variation that you see across.
I mean, there's a, I don't know if this tale is apocryphal, but like the Amazonian rainforest tribes living there have almost like 23 different words for green, different kinds of green.
Right.
And how Inuit communities have 17 different words for snow, for the kind of snow, for the powdery snow, for hard snow, compacted snow. So it, I guess, depends on community to community. There's also the famous case of Darwin struggling with barnacles, where to place them, as mollusk or crustaceans, because they have these, they are on the borderline. And you have these species that remain on the borderline that don't fall into a category. The most famous, I think, it would be the platypus, right? Because it displays characteristics of different classes of animals. So what do you think the British who came in here and started in a sense describing the species in an organized manner? Perhaps there may have been descriptions before that, but they kind of put it all together. However, there was also much damage that they did with bringing in of garden plants, bringing in of invasive trees and species. So how would you assess their contribution to conservation in India?
Both good and bad. It's a if you were to say ask me about taxonomy, it's a good thing. If you ask me about invasive species, it's a terrible thing. Okay, so you can't weigh them by the same scale. The point is that, again, perhaps people didn't realize at that point in time that something would become ecologically a problem species if they were to move it between continents, for example. Okay, so I'm not taking sides here, but I see the same thing still happening, because in this day and age, when people are more aware of these things, they still continue to do it. And so we've not learned from our mistakes. So I can't go back into history. I can't turn back the clock. All I can do is just, from now into the future, how can we learn from our historical mistakes and correct them and do better? That's it. So I would say that we need to learn from the mistakes the Brits made, both from the invasive species point of view, from the habitat management, forest management point of view, everything. We need to learn from their mistakes and not continue to do the same. And if we don't, we are committing a bigger mistake than what they committed 150 or 100 years back, without the knowledge, most likely without the knowledge.
Yeah, because there's a small group of very cynical people who try and ascribe nefarious sort of intent to the British, that ecological terrorism in knowingly they caused that damage. I don't think there is, I mean, personally, I don't think there is much truth to that. I think it was
I don't know. I was not a fly on the wall.
Yeah, but it just sounds like, it sounds a little far-fetched.
Yeah, it may be true.
Yeah.
May not be true. Who's to even guess what is it?
I would only say it sounds far-fetched because they intended to be here forever. So they wouldn't intentionally destroy an ecosystem. where they were intending to be, there forever.
Well, again, it's the way you look at it.
Hmm.
If you look at Nilgiris, for example,
The
you know,
wattles, they,
in Nilgiris, if you just think back even 200, 250 years ago, must have been a wonderful landscape of Shola grasslands,
Yeah.
native forests and native grasslands that have evolved there for tens of thousands of years, perhaps millions of years. And what did the British do? They came there. Now, this is where you can get into an argument of, they did things knowingly or unknowingly, but they moved, or rather removed, the native species and planted non-native ones. Because why? Perhaps they wanted it to, remind them more of their own place.
yes, Little
Okay.
Britain.
Okay. So yes, so I wouldn't say, okay, they did it knowingly or unknowingly. Maybe they did it knowingly in that instance. But like I said, there's no point in us arguing about this, and we can each interpret it in our own ways.
It's
but the
not
thing
a
is,
constructive argument.
it's history. We can't go back in time to turn back the clock. What can we do now?
Absolutely.
Is we can learn from those mistakes, not do those mistakes. Let's start correcting ourselves and let's start doing the right thing. If our intention is good, then what we do should also be good. Good intent should lead to good content.
Very interesting. And exactly, we need to learn from what mistakes have been made in the past. In British rule, the large scale timber was taken off the hills, the forests were cut down, and all that. We need to learn from that. But moving on, you've also had two species named after you. There's a spider and a fish also named after you. How did that come about?
Well, the spider one was by this gentleman, Dr. Patel, who was a famous arachnologist. And we had a workshop on tarantulas in 2001 in Paramikulam. And so he was one of the participants, and he happened to, I think, collect the spider there. And because, I've been working in this field then for about 10 years or so, he decided to name it after me. So that's how that turned up. And then more recently, under a bunch of close friends decided to name a species of fish after me. And so both of them happened without my knowledge. I came to know of it only after the publication came out. So that's how it is.
Wow. So your areas of study have been very vast. From reptiles to bats to mushrooms, and they involve both like kind of a microscopic knowledge of a particular species, but then also an overview of ecosystems, habitat. Is it easy to shift between these perspectives?
So the thing is that, the principles of conservation biology is the same. Okay, look at any species group. The principles remain the same. So I look at it from that perspective. I look at it from a broader perspective. I am interested in individual species and individual groups, but I'm more interested in biodiversity per se. And so when I go into the field, I do switch pretty fast, and I do look at different groups at the same time, appreciate. And when I'm looking at them, I'm not looking at the species per se. I'm looking at the composition of species and what's happening around. Nowadays, also looking at what invasives are, threatening those native species. So this is constantly running in my mind, and so that's what I do.
So, I always used to wonder when we were, taking, now it's something you cannot do, ride on elephant back in Corbett National Park, early morning in the winter, where the sightings are not very good. You don't see many tigers in the winter. But the forest in winter is just, early morning is just magical, the smells and the sights, and there's a little mist hanging over. It is absolutely magical. And you're sitting on this magnificent animal who's taking a snack here and there, stopping and having. And I used to wonder what this place must have looked like 300 years ago, 400 years ago. Do you think, how different would our forests have been? Like, When do you think the massive change happened? Like now we are going through lantana bushes and we have the eucalyptus tree and things like that. So where do you think the change has happened, or it's been gradual?
Well, it was been gradual for some time, but I think it became radical in the 1800s when the British actually started using these resources on a larger industrial scale. And so that's when the radical shift happened. And you can see with railway tracks being constructed just to transport timber, from the Eastern Ghats, from the Western Ghats, so many different places, you have. And so, that has definitely impacted. And shifting, from native species to even native monocultures is a huge problem. Shifting to non-native monocultures is a bigger problem. And, that's all happened in the forests. So if you look at many protected areas now, the protection for wildlife is more of a recent phenomenon. Earlier, they were protected for the timber they had. Okay. Teak plantations.
Yes.
Sal plantations.
Yeah, we have entire
eucalyptus plantations. Yeah. Okay. All these, some of them native to those regions, but others not native, but plantations were protected. And so, that was the, underlying reason why protection was provided. Apart from also some of those hills being, what do you say, hydro sheds, so also protecting the water bodies in terms of not natural water bodies, but reservoirs, dams built in mountainous areas. So those were the primary reasons why protected areas were developed in India. As an afterthought, they became also protected areas for wildlife. Okay, that is more of a recent phenomenon. So if you were to then ask, how these changes happened, yeah, those changes happened, and sometimes it's knowledge is a curse. So when people say, "Oh, you went to a forest, you must be enjoying life," said, "Yeah, I went to the forest, but I know what the forest is made of. I don't think I'm actually enjoying it because." Unfortunately, this is what's happened to it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, the care tree is another case in point. The care, it is used in the manufacture of katha. That is a primary ingredient in pan masala. And with the pan masala industry just growing and growing, entire khair forests have been wiped out. There's hardly any khair that you see. An area around Najibabad, we would see a lot of khair forest, which is completely gone. So it's quite something to see this change.
It is.
So are you optimistic about the future when you see there's so much bad news on the horizon, right? You are always confronted by bad news.
The news. You're swimming in bad news.
Yeah, so
continuously.
So
whatever stroke. Yeah, you're swimming in bad news.
Yeah.
But you're swimming with your head high. So optimism is there. Okay, so we need to do that. And there is a change. You can see that. It's happening very slowly. Wish more people would get into the fold. There are more anti-conservationists than there are conservationists adding to the equation every day. So we need to reverse that. And once that threshold changes, then we'll be in a better position. But nonetheless, we need to start working on it because conservation, after all, is for everyone. It doesn't distinguish social, financial,
Absolutely.
hierarchies. It just, is equal for everyone. So we are working towards everyone's equality rather than just one or the other. And to do conservation is not just the prerogative of humans not just prerogative of ensuring that humans survive better. It's also ensuring that all species survive well, because the better they survive, the impact is felt by us. And so it is very, very important.
Absolutely. On a personal note, how did you get interested in the natural world? Where would you trace it back to your childhood, or when did you get interested?
I think I remember as a kid, I used to play in our garden a lot of different species, and that's where I observed the
And which part of India were you
in
growing up
Bangalore.
in? Bangalore. Okay.
Lucas aspera, for example, that's how I know. And then there were other native herbs that we used to see. Um, so I've also at that point in time noticed new ones coming in, very exciting ones, touch me nots, uh, mimosas. Oh wow, look at this, and the entire
Yeah.
fascination.
As school kids, I remember we were very
Fascination
excited.
shifted
Yeah, yeah.
to touch me not. So
Yeah.
if you touch it closes, it's a wonderful thing. But we never realized at that point in time that that was actually replacing our native species. And then we woke up when Parthenium became a asthma plant. Okay, and lots of people in Bangalore started getting asthma, and at that point in time correlated to the spread of Parthenium. That's when it started dawning. Oh, okay, it's not an Indian species; it's come from Mexico, and so it's causing problems. That was an eye opener. But by then, I had already grown out of my younger days in terms of what I understood. But somewhere along the line, it sort of kept me interested. Although I never showed an interest like people do now in terms of, say, bird watching or this or that. I was always interested in things like earthworms. So I used to dig them out of the soil, or when I was gardening, I used to get them. So I would, play with them and let them go and stuff like that. Cockroaches. There are many native species of cockroaches that were different from the cockroaches we used to find in our kitchen. So I used to collect both the cockroaches and compare them. So things like that. As a kid, I used to do this, and also because my mom was extra scared of cockroaches, of geckos on the wall, and all
Also,
that.
it was your duty to get rid of
So
all of
and whenever I get punished by her, for doing something terrible, she would come chasing after me. So my defense was to go pick up a cockroach or catch a gecko from the wall,
Wow.
and then she would run, and I would run behind her. So things like that. These are so yeah. I guess all of them just fell into place, and yeah. When I got into the undergraduation, I did botany, chemistry, and zoology. I went into that willingly, and so wanted to continue in that field, not knowing what to do in particular, but just got into it, and then did my master's in zoology. And then during that time, I also had several different occasions on which I realized that okay, perhaps conservation is the best way to go.
But it's not a career that is high on the sort of demand list. I mean,
Yes.
with youngsters today, I mean, there are so many other areas, so many high paying areas people look at for a career. What do you think to young people who may be watching this? Is it viable as a career in conservation to get involved in conservation?
It is viable, much more viable now than 30 years back. Now you have more options. There are more people recognizing the need for conservation. There's some money available. Not everything in conservation needs to be voluntary nowadays. It's not that your career is going to go down the drain if you were to take up conservation. In fact, it's a growing field, and especially now with this correction of the disturbances that humans have caused, I think you can what I say is that people have made money destroying nature. Now you can't make money, but you can at least have a decent life by fixing nature. So why not do that? And so I encourage youngsters to take on conservation as a career choice, to become career conservationists. And I also urge the parents to encourage their kids to get into this line. It's challenging. It's heartbreaking a lot of the times, but it's also the need of the hour. If your child or your grandchild has to have a better future, if we do not conserve now, they have no future.
Mm.
So,
And what are the avenues you would recommend? Because most people would think getting into the forest service is the way. But are there other opportunities where can you, contribute the most?
lots of things, whatever you're doing, you can still contribute to conservation. So conservation, needs a whole lot of different people working. Everything from, say, other than conservationists working in the field, you need artists who can um, portray conservation in a much better light, in a more understandable light, in a format that is appreciable. Then you need storytellers. You need people who can break down the science to communicate to the general public. You need people who can help with the technical aspects of it, with the softwares, apps. You need people who can iron out a lot of the problems that that the wildlifers face. So there are a whole bunch of different things that people from different walks of life who are already engaged in their own areas can contribute positively to conservation. For those who are young, who are just graduating and want to get into something that is more natural and not into any of the development fields, I hate to call conservation as a development sector. It's they have a choice of entering into various different streams depending on their interest. Again, like I said, all of these different things they can get into, and not just as a conservationist working for an NGO or as a researcher working in an institute or in an academic setup, but you can do so many different things and still contribute. So yeah, the forestry service is one thing, but if you want to really get into conservation, you have a lot of different choices.
And lastly, I just want to ask you on a lighter note, if you had those traditional three wishes, we have these fairy tales where the person is granted three wishes. If you had three wishes as a conservationist, what are those three wishes for the future of the world?
Put me on the spot. If you were a genie, I would have really screwed it up. I would say knowledge, getting yourself educated with the right thing is the fundamental thing. Okay. From that, understanding what you need to do positively would be the next thing. And actually doing it would be the third thing.
Wow.
Okay.
That's wonderful.
So, good intent is supported by all these different things that are fundamental so that your content is good at the end of the day.
Fantastic. I wish I was a genie. I would have been happy to grant you all these things. But inshallah, with the work that you're doing and with the work that so many people are doing around the world, we will continue to improve knowledge and take the right action, correct course for the future, so that the swim is no longer in the pool of bad news. It's positive news and positive stories. Thank you so much for taking time out. And it was a joy to host you here at Ghana Shantivanam. And I hope you keep coming back. Your guidance would help, even because we may be well-intentioned, but there may be gaps in knowledge which need experts like you to help us sort out.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I say, there's no problem if there's a mistake made. If it's genuine, there's no problem.
Yeah.
You can fix it.
We did make a mistake. We actually had planted Conocarpus on the main avenue.
There you go.
So, and then the Conocarpus had grown to become a nice shady avenue. But when we realized what had happened, then it was again, but it's a grown tree. Do we cut it down? And then it was like, in the interest of future good, if you have to cut down a tree, it has to be done. So those tough decisions you also must be having to make.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are decisions that are not usually met very well by people. But the first point, knowledge, will help people make a better decision. So knowledge is always good to have because you know what is the right thing to do. And if the right thing to do is to cut down an invasive species, that's the right thing to do. And that's the only thing to do. Because otherwise you're going to just create more of a mess. So emotion is what drives us to do things. Science is what keeps us grounded to do the right thing.
Wow. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Welcome. Thanks a lot for having me here. I would love to come back, and yes, well, let's hope this is a continuing relationship and we'll get more things done.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot. See you then.